you will hear a recording. Write the missing words in each blank.
Almost everyone has heard of the London Stock Exchange, but relatively few know anything about the London Metal and Commodity Exchanges. Yet these markets have a greater influence on world economies because they set global prices for some of the essential raw materials for industry and food manufacture. The LME provides 3 basic services to the world's non-ferrous metal trade. First, it is a market where large or small quantities of metal of a guaranteed minimum standard can be bought and sold on specific trading days. Second, it acts as a barometer of world metal prices. And third, it is a hedging medium. That is, it can help traders get some protection from price fluctuations that occur for economic, political or financial reasons.
It isn't necessary to have a specialized knowledge of, say, the intricacies of counterpoint, or even to be able to read music to understand it. Usually getting the point of a piece of music, its emotional and dramatic impact, is immediate or simply requires you to become more familiar with it. Of course, prolonged study of music and its composition, as in any other field, will increase your understanding, but not necessarily your enjoyment. Now, I realize that it can require a good deal of willingness on our part to risk new sensations, and there is a lot of music that will seem unfamiliar and alien to you on a first hearing.
Before farming was introduced into Scotland, people lived by hunting, fishing, and gathering wild foodstuffs. This way of life meant that they usually didn't settle permanently in one place, but were to an extent nomadic, moving about in search of a livelihood, perhaps returning to the same places at certain times of the year. It is believed that the islands of Orkney were known to these people, but so far only a few flint tools have been found to verify this. This is because coastal erosion has destroyed many ancient sites, and these may have contained relics of some of these earliest pioneering colonists.
Paper was first manufactured in Europe by the Spanish in the 12th century, although it had been imported since the 10th century. Around the year 1276, a mill was established at Fabriano in Italy. The town became a major centre for paper making and throughout the 14th century provided most of Europe with fine quality paper, which it has continued to produce ever since. By the 15th century, paper was also being manufactured in Germany and France, and it was not long before both countries became almost completely independent of material bought overseas. With the increasing availability of paper in Europe, the production of identical printed pictures became almost inevitable.
The spinal cord, the link between the brain and the body, is a band of nervous tissue about the thickness of your little finger that runs through the backbone. Nerve cells called motor neurons convey electric impulses that travel from the brain to the spinal cord, branching off at the appropriate point and passing to the various parts of the body. Similarly, sensory neurons transmit messages from organs and tissues via the spinal cord to the brain. But the spinal cord also functions without the brain having to intervene. It alone controls those actions called spinal reflexes that need to be carried out very fast in response to danger.
The growth of the modern state brought with it the development of mass political parties and the emergence of professional politicians. A man whose occupation is the struggle for political power may go about it in two ways. First, a person who relies on their political activities to supply their main source of income is said to live off politics, while a person who engages in full-time political activities but who doesn't receive an income from it is said to live for politics. Now, a political system in which recruitment to positions of power is filled by those who live for politics is necessarily drawn from a property-owning elite who are not usually entrepreneurs. However, this is not to imply that such politicians will necessarily pursue policies which are wholly biased towards the interests of the class they originate from.
There have been many studies in America of the opinions and behavior of university lecturers and professors, and of well-known free or public thinkers who are not attached to a university or other institution, which show that those who are recognized as being more successful or productive as scholars in their field, or are at the best universities, are much more likely to have critical opinions. That is to say, that they are more likely to hold liberal views, in the American use of that word, than those of their colleagues who are less creative or who have less of a reputation. The better a university is, as measured by the test results of its students or by the prestige of its staff, the more likely it has been that there will be student unrest and a relatively left-of-center faculty.
However simple or complex the chain of events in any given situation, when looked into, it usually reveals a train of causal relationships. They are seen to be linked in some way. The methods of analysis aim to establish these relationships and provide a solid background for useful generalizations based on what at first appear to be separate events. The first step in this process is to collect facts and then see if any particular patterns emerge. If they do, it then becomes possible to form theories related to the facts, and this type of empirical theory forms a useful basis for analysis and prediction. However, on its own this theory is not enough. The essential second step is to test it by collecting more facts and by checking predictions against events. These new facts may mean you have to modify the theory, bearing in mind that new facts can only either disprove or support a theory. They cannot prove it to be right.
It is difficult to know how to place Montesquieu if you're the kind of person who likes to categorise. Historian, political philosopher, sociologist, jurist, or, if you think the Persian letters a novel, a novelist. He was all these things. Perhaps, as some have, he could be placed among that almost extinct species, the man of letters. The books that make up the spirit of the laws have had the most influence on later thinkers, and in them, as in his equally great Considerations on the Causes of the Grandeur and Decadence of the Romans, he makes his underlying purpose clear. It is to make the random, apparently meaningless variety of events understandable. He wanted to find out what the historical truth was. His starting point, then, was this almost endless variety of morals, customs, ideas, laws and institutions, and to make some sense out of them. He believed it was not chance that ruled the world, and that beyond the chaos of accidents, there must be underlying causes that account for the apparent madness of things. Privacy and the right to privacy are increasingly becoming hot topics in the media, which is a touch ironic given that it is often the media that is responsible for invasion of privacy. This is not just about those whose careers put them in the public eye, but ordinary people who, through no fault of their own, have come to public notice because of some event that has attracted the attention of the media. It might be that a member of their family has been imprisoned for some crime, rightfully or wrongfully, or perhaps they are the victims of some natural disaster. Some people argue that those who have chosen to be in the public sphere and have teams of public relations people to make sure they get as much public attention as possible, actors, rock stars, politicians and the like, have given up their right to privacy and get everything they deserve. Career curves.
There is such a thing as information overload. There is just so much information out there now that we can't cope with it or fully absorb it, or even decide which bits of it we want to keep in our minds or which to discard. There is a similar thing going on with the range of choices we have as consumers. There is so much stuff out there, so much to choose from that, according to some experts, this situation is making us miserable. Most of us believe that the more we have to choose from, the better. Yet, apparently, our dissatisfaction with this wealth of choice, or rather the anxiety it produces, is part of a larger trend. It seems that as society grows more affluent and people become freer to do what they want, the unhappier they become.
Postmodernism is, broadly speaking, a reaction against the movement or the period, or perhaps simply the values and beliefs of modernism. Most people, even those who seem to know what it is or was about, tend to define it in negative terms by telling us what it isn't or doesn't do. Initially, the term had a fairly limited application and referred to a new anti-modernist style of architecture. But it spread like a virus to include almost all aspects of contemporary culture. One thing we can be sure about is that it wanted to get rid of what were called the grand narratives by which we explained how the world and history got us from the past to the present. Another feature of postmodernism is its belief that truth and reality are human-centred and internal. That is, the primary source of truth in the present age is the self. This, I believe, has now all passed and been thrown in the rubbish bin of history. Yet it is difficult to know whether the age of information technology confirms the passing of postmodernism or is a consequence of it.
This being acquired and established, silence would be more easy, and my desire being to gain knowledge at the same time that I improved in virtue, and considering that in conversation it was obtained rather by the use of the ears than of the tongue, and therefore wishing to break a habit I was getting into of prattling, punning, and joking, which only made me acceptable to trifling company, I gave silence the second place. This and the next order I expected would allow me more time for attending to my project and my studies. Resolution, once became habitual, would keep me firm in my endeavors to obtain all the subsequent virtues. Frugality and industry freeing me from my remaining debt, and producing affluence and independence, would make more easy the practice of sincerity and justice, etc., etc. Conceiving then that, agreeably to the advice of Pythagoras in his golden verses, daily examination would be necessary.
Spring is in the air, and so are those dang insects hungry for a blood meal. The victim can wind up with a bunch of bites, red and itchy. So what drugs can quench that itch? Maybe none, according to a study in the Drug and Therapeutics Bulletin. Researchers reviewed the literature on a variety of treatments. Topical antihistamines, generally not recommended. They're only marginally effective and shouldn't be used for longer than 3 days. Oral analgesics like ibuprofen are sometimes recommended, but the scientists say there's no evidence supporting that. Topical anesthetics such as lidocaine are only marginally effective and can sensitize the skin, meaning the itching could ultimately get worse. And common topical steroids like hydrocortisone, the problem here is that they're not supposed to be used on broken skin, and if you've been scratching, that skin may already be broken. The authors recommend a simple approach: clean the area and use a cold pack to tamp down inflammation and numb the nerves. If you haven't broken the skin, try the steroid cream. But your best approach may be ice. The cold hard fact is that this cold hard treatment works.
If you have paraskevidecatria, today is not your day. That's right, paraskevidecatria is fear of Friday the 13th and the accidents, mishaps, and misfortunes thought by some to occur on that day. But is there anything really to fear? In fact, a study was conducted and published back in 1993 in the British Medical Journal that looked at hospital admissions due to accidents on one Friday the 13th compared with the previous Friday the 6th. The researchers tracked traffic on a highway in one part of England and found that many fewer cars were on the road on the 13th, perhaps due to people being leery of driving on that day, but hospital admissions in that area due to traffic accidents were actually higher. 45 people were admitted on the 6th, but 65 people were admitted on the 13th. The researchers concluded that a few people were indeed unlucky on that Friday the 13th in that part of England. Then again, what you really needed for this study was a control group that stays home only to slip in the bathtub.
It's tough to pick a familiar face out of a crowd, but focusing on a known voice in a noisy room is easy. And a new study scanned volunteers' brains to look at how we solve the so-called cocktail party problem. The work is in the journal Nature. Researchers recorded the activity of the subjects' cerebral cortexes while playing them sentences spoken by different voices. First, the subjects listened to individual sentences and reported key features of each one.
If you were driving in 1981, your car probably
Then they
got
heard two
lousy
different
miles.
sentences played at the same time,
If you
Dengue
were driving
infection
in
flipped a switch on
1981, your car
140
probably
but had to
got
listen
lousy
to and
miles.
recall details from only one voice. Each voice drew a particular response from the auditory cortex, and even with an extra sentence playing simultaneously, researchers saw that the cortex responded specifically to the voice that the subject was focusing on. This finding indicates that our brains process sound based not only on the audio input they receive, but also on our listening goals, and it could lead to speech recognition systems that are accurate in crowds, even at a cocktail party.
Tens of millions of sharks are killed for their fins each year. It's not just a tragic abuse of the animals, it's bad business.
They're basically swimming dollar signs, whether you're trying to kill them for their meat or their fins, or you're interested in looking at them for ecotourism.
That's Austin Gallagher, a doctoral student at the University of Miami. I spoke with him on February 26th.
And we did some calculations, and the results were remarkable. We determined that the average shark was worth about $200,000 over the course of its life. And when you compare it to finning that animal, a one-time extractive use, seeing it for diving is worth about 40% more.
Gallagher and his doctoral advisor Neil Hammerschlag published the study last year in Current Issues in Tourism.
And since this paper came out, I got an email from somebody in Bali just a few weeks ago saying, we're using your paper to stop illegal harvest of thresher sharks in Bali at a local dive community.
Obese people have higher risks for diabetes, heart disease, arthritis, and injuries in car accidents? Yes, in part because they're far less likely to wear a seatbelt. That's the finding of a study out of the University of Buffalo that'll be presented at an upcoming meeting of the Society for Academic Emergency Medicine in Chicago. The researchers analyzed data in the National Fatality Analysis Reporting System of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. The study included 1/3 of a million drivers involved in fatal crashes. 2 years ago, the research group found that morbidly obese people were 56% more likely to die in a car crash than normal weight car occupants. The new study revealed that drivers of normal weight are 67% more likely to wear a seatbelt than are obese drivers, which could account for at least part of the increased death risk. The researchers hypothesized that overweight people find belts uncomfortable and difficult to buckle. A weight loss program can address the problem in the long run, and inexpensive seatbelt extension can solve it today.
Does your puppy turn his nose up at his own chow because he wants some of whatever it is that you're having? A new study finds that when it comes to food, dogs recognize human social signals about what's good. The work is in the journal Public Library of Science 1. Researchers let pet dogs choose between 2 plates, one with a single piece of food and the other with 6 pieces. Unsurprisingly, the animals generally went for the larger portion, but when a human being showed a clear liking for the smaller plate, the canines likewise went for the skimpier choice. The dogs apparently recognized and responded to the human's social cues. And not all cues were equally effective. When the human approached but did not touch the smaller portion, dogs ignored the attention-drawing gesture. For a social signal to influence behavior, it had to demonstrate intention. And the most effective cues also involved communication, such as looking from the food to the dog and back while talking encouragingly. For dogs, choosing a bite may depend on another's bark. One family generally dines on Chinese takeout while their neighbors eat home-cooked meatloaf. You say potato, I say potato. And humans aren't the only primate species with cultural differences. Even in the same environment, different groups of chimpanzees use different tools. The work is in Current Biology. Chimps living in a national park in Côte d'Ivoire like eating kula nuts. They hammer them open with stone or wood. At the beginning of the season, the nutshells are harder, so you might expect all the chimps in the forest to initially use stone hammers and then switch to easy-to-find wooden tools when the nut cracking requires less force. But researchers examined the tool use of 3 different chimpanzee communities and found that despite sharing genes and a habitat, each group chose their hammers differently. For example, one group preferred stone hammers throughout the kula nut season. Another gradually transitioned from primarily stone to primarily wooden tools, and the third community switched from stone to wood more quickly. Hammer size also varied from group to group. As a chimp might explain, you say tomato, I say...